In the sweltering border city of Matamoros, Tamaulipas, where the Rio Grande separates Mexico from the United States by little more than a stone's throw, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was born on May 18, 1967, into a world where legitimate opportunities were scarce and the allure of illicit commerce beckoned from every corner. This was a city where geography had always been destiny, where the invisible line between two nations created opportunities for those willing to exploit the economic disparities that defined the border region. Matamoros, in the late 1960s, was a city caught between two worlds, struggling to define its identity in the shadow of Brownsville, Texas, just across the river. The maquiladora industry was beginning to transform the Mexican side of the border, bringing factories and employment opportunities that promised legitimate paths to prosperity. However, these legal enterprises operated alongside a parallel economy that had existed for generations, built on the movement of goods and people across an international boundary that was more porous than either government cared to admit. The Cárdenas family represented the working-class aspirations that characterized much of Matamoros during this period. Osiel's father worked in legitimate employment, struggling to provide for his family in an economy where honest labor often failed to generate sufficient income to escape poverty. His mother, like countless other women in the border region, supplemented the family income through various informal economic activities that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal commerce. Young Osiel grew up in neighborhoods where the boundaries between legitimate business and criminal enterprise were deliberately obscured, where success was measured not by the source of one's income, but by the ability to provide for family and community. The cultural environment of Matamoros during the 1970s was characterized by a pragmatic acceptance of economic realities that made moral distinctions about the source of prosperity seem like luxuries that few could afford. The educational opportunities available to children from working-class families in Matamoros were limited by both economic constraints and the practical demands of survival. While Mexico's public education system provided basic instruction, the quality of schools and the resources available to students varied dramatically based on the economic status of their communities. For families struggling to meet basic needs, the opportunity costs associated with extended education often outweighed the uncertain benefits of academic achievement. Records from Osiel's elementary school years suggest a bright but restless child whose potential was evident to teachers, but whose attention was increasingly drawn to the more immediate rewards available through alternative paths. Like many children in border communities, he possessed an intuitive understanding of the economic dynamics that governed daily life, recognizing from an early age that traditional routes to success were often blocked by circumstances beyond individual control. The teenager who emerged from this environment possessed qualities that would later prove valuable in criminal enterprises: intelligence, charisma, and an ability to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. However, these same traits might have led to legitimate success under different circumstances, highlighting the role that environmental factors play in shaping individual destinies. During his adolescent years, Osiel began to gravitate toward older youths who were involved in small-scale criminal activities that were common throughout the border region. These activities initially consisted of minor smuggling operations, theft, and various forms of fraud that required minimal investment but offered the possibility of substantial returns. The skills developed through these early criminal experiences would later prove applicable to much larger and more sophisticated operations. The social structure of Matamoros during the 1980s created numerous opportunities for young people to become involved in illegal activities without necessarily understanding the long-term consequences of their choices. The border economy operated according to its own logic, where traditional moral distinctions often gave way to practical considerations about survival and advancement. For ambitious young men like Osiel, the criminal underworld offered apprenticeships in entrepreneurship that were unavailable through legitimate channels. The geographic advantages that made Matamoros valuable for legitimate trade also made it attractive for criminal enterprises. The city's location on the Rio Grande provided access to multiple transportation routes, while its proximity to major American cities created market opportunities that could generate enormous profits for those willing to accept the associated risks. The infrastructure developed for legitimate commerce could be easily adapted for illegal purposes, creating synergies that benefited both types of economic activity. The law enforcement environment in Matamoros during Osiel's youth was characterized by limited resources, systemic corruption, and conflicting jurisdictions that created numerous opportunities for criminal enterprises to operate operate with minimal interference. Local police forces were often overwhelmed by the scope of illegal activities while being compromised by corruption that made effective enforcement nearly impossible. Federal agencies had limited presence in the region, while American law enforcement faced jurisdictional constraints that limited their ability to operate across the border. The border region during the 1980s was undergoing rapid transformation as international trade agreements and economic policies created new opportunities for both legitimate business and criminal enterprises. The growth of cross-border commerce provided cover for illegal activities, while the increasing volume of legitimate traffic made detection of illicit goods more difficult for law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border. Osiel's entry into more serious criminal activities coincided with the emergence of Mexican organized crime groups as major players in the international narcotics trade. During the 1980s, Colombian criminal organizations that had dominated the cocaine trafficking industry began seeking new routes and partnerships as law enforcement pressure in the Caribbean forced them to develop alternative smuggling corridors. The transformation of Mexican organized crime during this period was remarkable, as groups that had previously focused on relatively small-scale smuggling operations began to develop the sophistication and resources necessary to compete in international markets. The enormous profits available through controlled substances trafficking provided resources for expansion and modernization that enabled Mexican organizations to evolve from regional criminal groups into transnational enterprises. The Gulf Cartel, which had been operating in the Tamaulipas region since the 1930s, initially focused on smuggling various contraband goods across the border, including alcohol during Prohibition and various consumer goods that were subject to high tariffs or import restrictions. However, the organization began to recognize the enormous profit potential associated with controlled substances trafficking as demand increased in the United States market. Juan Garcia Abrego, who controlled the Gulf Cartel during the 1980s and early 1990s, represented a new generation of Mexican criminal leaders who understood the importance of building relationships with Colombian suppliers while maintaining control over crucial smuggling territories along the border. His organization operated with a level of sophistication that exceeded anything previously seen in Mexican organized crime, utilizing advanced communication systems, corruption networks, and logistical capabilities that rivaled those of legitimate businesses. The corporate-style management that Garcia Abrego brought to the Gulf Cartel created opportunities for ambitious individuals who could demonstrate competence in complex operations requiring coordination, planning, and strategic thinking. The organization needed personnel who could manage logistics, negotiate with suppliers and customers, coordinate intelligence operations, and maintain relationships with political figures and law enforcement officials. It was within this evolving criminal landscape that Osiel Cárdenas Guillén began his ascent through the ranks of the Gulf Cartel organization. His intelligence and leadership abilities quickly attracted the attention of senior figures within the group, who recognized his potential value as both an operational leader and a strategic thinker. The skills he had developed during his youth in Matamoros proved directly applicable to the challenges associated with managing complex criminal enterprises. The 1990s marked a period of unprecedented growth and sophistication for Mexican organized crime groups as they expanded their role in the international narcotics trade from transportation services to full-scale trafficking operations. The Gulf Cartel, under Garcia Abrego's leadership, established relationships with Colombian suppliers that allowed them to purchase controlled substances at wholesale prices and manage their distribution throughout the United States market. Osiel's responsibilities within the organization expanded rapidly during this period as he demonstrated both the operational competence and leadership qualities necessary for senior positions within the criminal hierarchy. His assignments included managing smuggling operations, coordinating with corrupt officials, and overseeing the resolution of conflicts with rival organizations. Each successful operation enhanced his reputation within the cartel and increased his influence over strategic decisions. The sophisticated nature of the Gulf Cartel's operations during the 1990s required skills that went far beyond traditional criminal activities. The organization needed individuals who could manage complex logistics, negotiate with suppliers and customers, coordinate intelligence operations, and maintain relationships with political figures and law enforcement officials. Osiel proved capable in all these areas, establishing himself as an indispensable member of the leadership team. The financial resources generated generated by the Gulf Cartel's trafficking operations were enormous, allowing the organization to invest in advanced technology, weapons and communication systems that provided significant advantages over rival groups and law enforcement agencies. The cartel's annual revenues during this period were estimated to exceed those of many legitimate corporations, creating opportunities for expansion and diversification that traditional criminal groups had never possessed. The corruption networks that the Gulf Cartel maintained throughout the border region were extensive and sophisticated, involving relationships with political figures, law enforcement officials, and business leaders who could provide protection and assistance in exchange for financial compensation. These networks were essential for the organization's success, as they provided early warning of law enforcement operations while creating opportunities for legitimate business activities that could serve as fronts for criminal operations. However, success in the narcotics trafficking industry also brought increased scrutiny from law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border. The United States government began to recognize Mexican criminal organizations as serious threats to national security, implementing new strategies and dedicating additional resources to combat their activities. This pressure created both challenges and opportunities for ambitious individuals within the criminal organizations. The organizational culture that developed within the Gulf Cartel during this period emphasized loyalty, competence, and strategic thinking over the violence and intimidation that characterized many criminal groups. Garcia Abrego understood that sustainable success required business-like approaches to planning and operations, creating an environment where individuals with management skills could advance based on performance rather than simply their capacity for violence. Osiel's advancement within this merit-based system reflected his ability to contribute to the organization's success through intelligence, planning, and leadership, rather than simply through intimidation or brutality. His reputation for competence and reliability made him a valuable asset in an organization that required sophisticated coordination of complex operations across multiple jurisdictions and markets. The international dimensions of the Gulf Cartel's operations during the 1990s required personnel who could navigate different legal systems, cultural environments, and business practices. Osiel's experience and intelligence made him particularly valuable for operations that required interaction with foreign suppliers, coordination of international transportation, and management of distribution networks in different countries. The technological innovations that the Gulf Cartel adopted during this period included advanced communication systems, sophisticated transportation methods, and financial management techniques that enabled the organization to operate with efficiency and security that exceeded anything previously seen in Mexican organized crime. These innovations required personnel with technical expertise and strategic vision who could implement new approaches while maintaining operational security. The arrest of Juan Garcia Abrego in 1996 marked a watershed moment in the history of the Gulf Cartel and created the power vacuum that would allow Osiel Cárdenas Guillén to emerge as the organization's new leader. Garcia Abrego's capture by Mexican authorities, followed by his extradition to the United States, demonstrated the increasing effectiveness of international law enforcement cooperation while simultaneously creating opportunities for the next generation of criminal leaders. The internal struggle for control of the Gulf Cartel following Garcia Abrego's arrest was intense and violent, as various factions within the organization competed for leadership positions and territorial control. Osiel's success in this competition was attributed to his combination of strategic intelligence, operational competence, and ability to build coalitions among different groups within the cartel. His victory was not predetermined, but resulted from careful planning and decisive action during a critical period. The leadership transition that brought Osiel to power represented more than a simple change in personnel. It marked the beginning of a new era in Mexican organized crime that would be characterized by increased violence, military-style organization, and systematic challenges to government authority. The young man from Matamoros, who had learned his trade in the streets of the border region, was about to implement innovations that would transform the nature of criminal organizations throughout the hemisphere. The vision that Osiel brought to the Gulf Cartel leadership differed significantly from that of his predecessor, reflecting both his personality and his analysis of the changing environment in which the organization operated. While Garcia Abrego had focused primarily on maintaining profitable operations while avoiding confrontation with authorities, Osiel recognized that survival in the evolving landscape of Mexican organized crime would require more aggressive strategies and enhanced defensive capabilities. By the late 1990s, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén had completed his transformation from a street-level criminal in Matamoros to the leader of one of Mexico's most powerful criminal organizations. The journey that had begun in the border neighborhoods of his youth had culminated in control over an enterprise that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue and wielded influence throughout the region and beyond. The young man who had grown up watching goods and people flow across the international boundary was now in position to control significant portions of that flow, directing operations that affected communities throughout Mexico and the United States. However, his most significant contribution to the evolution of organized crime was yet to come, as he prepared to implement innovations that would fundamentally alter the nature of criminal organizations and create new forms of violence that would affect millions of people. The foundation had been laid for developments that would reshape not only the Gulf Cartel, but the entire landscape of Mexican organized crime, creating new challenges for law enforcement and new threats to civil society that would persist long after Osiel himself had been removed from power. The boy from Matamoros had become a man whose decisions would influence the course of criminal organizations throughout Latin America and beyond. The ascension of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén to leadership of the Gulf Cartel in 1997 marked the beginning of a new era in Mexican organized crime, characterized by unprecedented levels of sophistication, violence, and territorial ambition. Unlike his predecessor, who had focused primarily on maintaining profitable smuggling operations while avoiding confrontation with authorities, Osiel possessed a vision that extended far beyond traditional criminal activities to encompass the creation of a criminal empire that would challenge the Mexican state's monopoly on violence. The Gulf Cartel that Osiel inherited was already one of Mexico's most powerful criminal organizations, controlling crucial smuggling territories along the border with Texas and maintaining extensive corruption networks throughout the region. However, the organization faced significant challenges from rival groups, increased law enforcement pressure, and internal conflicts that threatened to fragment the coalition that had enabled its success during the Garcia Abrego era. The immediate aftermath of Garcia Abrego's arrest had created a dangerous power vacuum within the Gulf Cartel, as various factions competed for control while external enemies sensed weakness and opportunity. Several mid-level leaders believed they possessed legitimate claims to leadership, while regional commanders who had operated with relative autonomy under the previous regime were reluctant to accept subordination to any new authority. This internal instability threatened to destroy the organization from within before external pressures could even be addressed. Osiel's first priority as leader was to neutralize potential rivals within the organization and consolidate control over the cartel's diverse factions. This process involved both strategic negotiation and selective violence, as he worked to build loyalty among key lieutenants while eliminating those who posed threats to his authority. The methods he employed during this consolidation period would later influence his approach to external conflicts and territorial expansion. The elimination of internal rivals was conducted with surgical precision, targeting individuals whose opposition could not be overcome through negotiation or incentives. These operations served multiple purposes, removing immediate threats to Osiel's authority, demonstrating his willingness to use violence against former allies, and establishing his reputation for decisive action among remaining organization members. The psychological impact of these eliminations was carefully calculated to discourage future challenges while avoiding the wholesale bloodshed that could destabilize the organization. Simultaneously, Osiel implemented a comprehensive restructuring of the Gulf Cartel's organizational hierarchy, creating clear command structures and defined responsibilities that enhanced both efficiency and security. He established specialized units responsible for different aspects of the organization's activities, including transportation, security, intelligence, and financial management, creating a corporate-style hierarchy that distinguished his leadership from the more informal arrangements that had characterized earlier periods. The appointment of trusted associates to key leadership positions was crucial to Osiel's consolidation strategy, as he needed individuals whose loyalty was unquestionable and whose competence could ensure effective implementation of his directives. Many of these appointments involved promoting individuals who had worked closely with him during his rise through the organization, creating a leadership team whose success was directly tied to his own continued authority. The territorial reorganization that Osiel implemented divided the Gulf Cartel's area of influence into clearly defined zones, each under the control of a regional commander responsible for all criminal activities within their assigned territory. This structure provided accountability and coordination that had been lacking under previous arrangements, while enabling rapid response to threats or opportunities that emerged in different areas. The financial resources available to the Gulf Cartel under Osiel's leadership were enormous, generated primarily through the trafficking of controlled substances from Colombia and other South American countries to markets throughout the United States. Conservative estimates suggest that the organization's annual revenues during this period exceeded $500 million, providing resources that exceeded those available to many legitimate corporations and most government agencies in the region. These unprecedented financial resources enabled Osiel to implement strategies and acquire capabilities that had been impossible for earlier generations of Mexican criminal leaders. The organization could afford to purchase advanced technology, sophisticated weapons systems, and specialized expertise that provided significant advantages over both rival criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies. More importantly, these resources enabled sustained investment in long-term strategic initiatives that would pay dividends over many years. The technological infrastructure that Osiel developed for the Gulf Cartel represented a quantum leap beyond anything previously seen in Mexican organized crime. The organization invested in encrypted communication systems, satellite telecommunications, sophisticated surveillance equipment, and coordination technologies that enabled real-time management of operations across vast territories. These systems provided both security against law enforcement surveillance and operational advantages that enhanced the effectiveness of criminal activities. The weapons and equipment acquired by the Gulf Cartel during this period included military-grade assault rifles, grenades, rocket-propelled weapons, armored vehicles, and specialized gear that exceeded the capabilities of many official security forces. The organization's purchasing power enabled acquisition of equipment that was typically restricted to military and law enforcement agencies, creating arsenals that provided tactical advantages in confrontations with both rivals and government forces. The territorial control exercised by the Gulf Cartel under Osiel's leadership extended throughout much of northeastern Mexico, including the crucial border states of Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and parts of Veracruz. This territory encompassed some of the most valuable smuggling corridors in Mexico, providing access to major metropolitan areas on both sides of the border and enabling the organization to control substantial portions of the illicit trade between Mexico and the United States. However, maintaining control over this extensive territory required constant vigilance and the ability to respond quickly to challenges from rival organizations, law enforcement agencies, and internal threats. The traditional approach to territorial defense employed by Mexican criminal organizations relied primarily on corruption and selective violence, but Osiel recognized that these methods were becoming insufficient as competition intensified and government pressure increased. The corruption networks that Osiel maintained throughout the region were extensive and sophisticated, involving relationships with political figures, law enforcement officials, and military officers at various levels of government. These relationships were cultivated through a combination of financial incentives, personal favors, and strategic alliances that served the interests of both the criminal organization and corrupt officials. The systematic nature of these corruption efforts represented a significant evolution from the ad hoc bribery that had characterized earlier generations of Mexican criminal organizations. Osiel understood that effective corruption required long-term investment in relationships, careful selection of targets, and ongoing maintenance of loyalty through both rewards and consequences. The organization developed detailed databases of corrupt officials, tracking their responsibilities, vulnerabilities, and value to criminal operations. The financial mechanisms used to maintain these corruption networks were sophisticated and secure, utilizing legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, and various forms of asset transfer to ensure that payments could not be easily traced by investigators. The organization employed financial specialists who understood both Mexican and international banking systems, enabling the movement of substantial sums without triggering regulatory scrutiny. The intelligence capabilities that the Gulf Cartel developed under Osiel's leadership were remarkable for their sophistication and effectiveness. The organization maintained networks of informants throughout government agencies, rival criminal organizations, and civil society institutions, providing early warning of law enforcement operations and valuable information about competitor activities. These intelligence operations were coordinated through specialized units within the cartel that employed former military and law enforcement personnel with expertise in surveillance, communication interception, and strategic analysis. The information gathered through these efforts was used to support both defensive operations and offensive actions against rivals and government forces. The intelligence gathering techniques employed by the organization included electronic surveillance, human intelligence networks, financial investigations, and systematic monitoring of government communications. These capabilities enabled the Gulf Cartel to anticipate law enforcement operations, identify vulnerabilities in rival organizations, and coordinate complex operations with precision that exceeded anything previously seen in Mexican organized crime. The operational security measures implemented by Osiel during this period reflected his understanding that effective criminal organizations required protection against both external threats and internal betrayal. The cartel developed sophisticated protocols for communication, transportation, and financial transactions that minimized exposure to law enforcement surveillance while maintaining operational efficiency. These security measures included the use of code words and encrypted communications, frequent changes of location and routine, careful screening of personnel, and systematic compartmentalization of information to limit the damage that could result from the capture or defection of individual members. The effectiveness of these measures was demonstrated by the organization's ability to continue operations despite intense pressure from Mexican and United States law enforcement agencies. The diversification of criminal activities that occurred under Osiel's leadership extended the Gulf Cartel's operations beyond traditional controlled substances trafficking to include kidnapping, extortion, human trafficking, and various forms of contraband smuggling. This diversification provided multiple revenue streams while reducing the organization's dependence on any single illicit market. The expansion into kidnapping operations was particularly significant, as it demonstrated the cartel's willingness to target not only rival criminals and law enforcement officials, but also members of the general population, including business leaders, politicians, and wealthy individuals. These operations generated substantial revenues while serving as tools for intimidation and territorial control. The kidnapping operations developed by the Gulf Cartel were characterized by careful planning, professional execution, and systematic approaches to ransom collection that minimized risks while maximizing profits. The organization identified targets through extensive surveillance and intelligence gathering, selecting individuals whose families possessed sufficient resources to pay substantial ransoms while avoiding targets whose disappearance might trigger intensive law enforcement responses. The human trafficking operations developed by the Gulf Cartel under Osiel's leadership exploited the same border infrastructure that supported controlled substances smuggling, providing services to migrants seeking to enter the United States illegally. However, these operations were characterized by extreme violence and exploitation, as the organization treated human beings as expendable commodities in pursuit of profit. The scale of these human trafficking operations was enormous, involving thousands of migrants each year who paid substantial fees for transportation across the border. The organization controlled routes, safe houses, and transportation networks that enabled systematic movement of people while generating revenues that supplemented income from other criminal activities. The relationship between the Gulf Cartel and Colombian supplier organizations evolved significantly during Osiel's tenure as leader, as he negotiated agreements that provided more favorable terms and greater operational autonomy for his organization. These negotiations reflected his growing confidence and the increased leverage that resulted from the cartel's enhanced capabilities and territorial control. The partnerships developed with Colombian groups enabled the Gulf Cartel to expand its role in the international narcotics trade, from transportation services to comprehensive trafficking operations that included purchasing, processing, transportation, and distribution activities. This vertical integration increased profit margins while providing greater control over supply chains and market access. The processing facilities that the Gulf Cartel established during this period were sophisticated operations that could refine raw materials into finished products ready for distribution in consumer markets. These facilities required substantial investment in equipment, personnel, and security, but they provided strategic advantages that justified the costs and risks involved. The distribution networks that the organization developed extended throughout the United States, reaching major metropolitan areas and smaller communities where demand for controlled substances generated substantial profits. These networks required careful coordination and management, as they involved numerous individuals operating in environments where law enforcement pressure was intense and competition was fierce. The violence that characterized the Gulf Cartel's operations under Osiel's leadership reached unprecedented levels as the organization employed brutality not only as a means of resolving conflicts, but also as a tool for psychological warfare against rivals and government forces. The methods employed during this period included torture, public displays of executed enemies, and attacks on civilian targets designed to demonstrate the organization's power and ruthlessness. This escalation of violence represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Mexican organized crime, as criminal organizations moved beyond targeted elimination of specific threats to embrace terrorism as a strategic tool. The psychological impact of this violence extended far beyond direct participants in criminal activities, affecting entire communities and challenging the Mexican government's ability to maintain public order. The public relations strategy employed by the Gulf Cartel during this period demonstrated Osiel's understanding of the importance of public perception in maintaining both criminal reputation and operational security. The organization cultivated relationships with journalists and media outlets that could be used to disseminate information favorable to the cartel while intimidating those who might report critically on their activities. The use of media manipulation and propaganda represented a sophisticated approach to information warfare that had not been previously employed by Mexican criminal organizations. This strategy included the strategic release of information about government corruption, the promotion of narratives that portrayed the cartel as protectors of local communities, and the intimidation of journalists who reported critically on their activities. The international expansion of Gulf Cartel operations under Osiel's leadership extended the organization's reach beyond Mexico to include activities in Central America, South America, and the United States. This expansion was facilitated by partnerships with local criminal groups and the establishment of operational cells in key metropolitan areas. The development of these international networks required sophisticated coordination and management capabilities that demonstrated the organization's evolution from a regional criminal group to a transnational enterprise capable of operating across multiple jurisdictions and legal systems. The success of these expansion efforts enhanced the cartel's resources while creating new vulnerabilities to law enforcement pressure. The financial management systems developed by the Gulf Cartel during this period were remarkably sophisticated, involving complex money laundering operations that utilized legitimate businesses, international banking systems, and various forms of asset conversion to conceal the sources of criminal revenues. These operations required expertise in international finance, regulatory compliance, and business management that exceeded the capabilities of traditional criminal organizations. The legitimate businesses established or acquired by the cartel served multiple functions within the organization's operations, providing cover for illegal activities while generating additional revenues and offering opportunities for money laundering. These enterprises included construction companies, transportation firms, retail establishments, and service businesses that were integrated into the broader criminal enterprise. The political influence exercised by the Gulf Cartel under Osiel's leadership extended beyond simple corruption to encompass strategic intervention in electoral processes, policy debates, and government decision-making at various levels. The organization's wealth and coercive capabilities enabled it to influence outcomes in ways that served its strategic interests while undermining democratic institutions. This political influence was exercised through a combination of financial support for favored candidates, intimidation of opposition figures, and strategic alliances with political factions that could provide protection and favorable treatment. The effectiveness of these efforts was demonstrated by the organization's ability to operate with relative impunity despite its high profile and obvious criminal activities. The recruitment strategies employed by the Gulf Cartel under Osiel's leadership focused on attracting individuals with specific skills and expertise that could enhance the organization's capabilities. This approach represented a departure from traditional criminal recruitment methods that relied primarily on family connections and neighborhood relationships. The targeted recruitment efforts included the systematic identification and cultivation of former military personnel, law enforcement officers, technical specialists, and individuals with expertise in finance, logistics, and other specialized fields. These recruitment efforts were facilitated by the organization's substantial financial resources and reputation for professionalism. By the early 2000s, the Gulf Cartel under Osiel's leadership had evolved into one of the most sophisticated and powerful criminal organizations organizations in the hemisphere, commanding resources and capabilities that rivaled those of many nation-states. The organization controlled extensive territories, generated enormous revenues, and wielded influence that extended throughout Mexican society and beyond. However, this very success created vulnerabilities that would ultimately contribute to the organization's transformation and Osiel's eventual downfall. The high profile associated with the cartel's activities attracted increasing attention from law enforcement agencies, while the violence and intimidation that characterized its operations generated public pressure for government action. The empire that Osiel had built was becoming too large and too visible to remain sustainable under existing conditions, setting the stage for developments that would fundamentally alter both the Gulf Cartel and the broader landscape of Mexican organized crime. The success of his consolidation efforts had created an organization with capabilities and ambitions that exceeded anything previously seen in criminal enterprises, but these same achievements would ultimately prove to be sources of both strength and vulnerability as new challenges emerged. The decision that would forever change the nature of organized violence in Mexico came to Osiel Cárdenas Guillén during a moment of strategic reflection in late 1997 as he analyzed the escalating threats facing his newly consolidated Gulf Cartel empire. Traditional approaches to personal and organizational security, which relied primarily on loyal criminals armed with conventional weapons, were proving inadequate against the sophisticated challenges posed by rival cartels and increasingly aggressive law enforcement operations. The catalyst for this revolutionary decision was a series of assassination attempts and territorial incursions that demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful criminal organizations to coordinated attacks by well-trained adversaries. During one particularly close call, rival gunmen had managed to penetrate multiple layers of security around Osiel's convoy, coming within meters of their target before being repelled by his bodyguards. The incident revealed fundamental weaknesses in traditional criminal security arrangements that could not be addressed through conventional means. Osiel recognized that surviving in this evolving environment would require defensive capabilities that exceeded anything previously seen in Mexican organized crime, leading him to conceive of an entirely new approach to criminal organization structure. The solution that emerged from this strategic analysis was audacious in its scope and unprecedented in its implications: the systematic recruitment of elite military personnel to serve as the enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel. This decision represented a fundamental departure from traditional criminal organization practices, as it involved the deliberate militarization of criminal enterprises through the incorporation of individuals trained in advanced combat techniques, tactical planning, and military discipline. The concept was so radical that it had no precedent in the history of Mexican organized crime, making it both a calculated risk and a potential game-changing innovation. The Mexican military during the late 1990s was undergoing significant transformation as economic pressures and political changes created conditions that made some personnel vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations. The end of the Cold War had reduced international tensions that had previously justified large military budgets, while Mexico's transition to democracy had created new oversight mechanisms that limited traditional sources of military influence and resources. The relatively low salaries paid to military personnel, combined with limited opportunities for advancement and the psychological stresses associated with counter-narcotics operations, created a pool of potential recruits with exactly the skills and experience that Osiel required. Many soldiers found themselves conducting operations against criminal organizations that obviously possessed far greater resources than the military units pursuing them, creating frustrations that could be exploited by sophisticated recruitment efforts. The initial recruitment efforts focused specifically on members of the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, known as GAFE, an elite special forces unit that had received advanced training from United States and Israeli military advisors. These soldiers possessed expertise in counterinsurgency operations, urban warfare, intelligence gathering, and sophisticated weapons systems that far exceeded the capabilities of traditional criminal organizations. GAFE personnel had been trained to operate in small units behind enemy lines, conducting reconnaissance, direct action missions, and unconventional warfare operations that required initiative, adaptability, and advanced technical skills. Their training emphasized physical fitness, marksmanship, tactical communications, and psychological warfare techniques that were directly applicable to the challenges facing criminal organizations in competitive environments. The selection criteria for GAFE recruitment were extremely rigorous, ensuring that only individuals with exceptional capabilities and psychological profiles suitable for high-stress operations were accepted into the unit. This screening process had already identified individuals with the exact characteristics that Osiel needed for his revolutionary security organization: intelligence, physical capability, discipline, and the ability to function effectively under extreme pressure. The first recruit was Arturo Guzman de Tena, known by the codename Z1, a GAFE lieutenant who had become disillusioned with military service and attracted by the enormous financial opportunities offered by the Gulf Cartel. Guzman de Tena's recruitment marked the beginning of what would become known as Los Zetas, an organization that would eventually evolve from a personal security detail into one of the most feared criminal groups in the Western Hemisphere. Guzman de Tena's background was typical of the elite soldiers that Osiel sought to recruit. Born in Puebla in 1976, he had demonstrated exceptional aptitude during military training and had been selected for advanced instruction in counterinsurgency and special operations. His military record included commendations for performance under combat conditions, leadership capabilities, and technical proficiency that marked him as a rising star within the Mexican military hierarchy. However, Guzman de Tena had also experienced the frustrations that affected many dedicated military personnel during this period. Despite his obvious capabilities and commitment to service, his career advancement was limited by budget constraints and bureaucratic obstacles that prevented the military from adequately rewarding excellence. The contrast between his professional contributions and his economic compensation created vulnerabilities that Osiel's recruitment efforts could exploit. The initial approach to Guzman de Tena was carefully planned and executed, involving months of surveillance and analysis to identify his personal circumstances, financial needs, and psychological vulnerabilities. The recruitment process began with seemingly casual contacts that gradually evolved into more direct discussions about opportunities for employment that could utilize his specialized skills while providing compensation commensurate with his abilities. Guzman de Tena's role in the subsequent recruitment efforts was crucial, as his military connections and understanding of special forces culture enabled him to identify and approach potential candidates who might be receptive to offers from the Gulf Cartel. The recruitment process was carefully planned and executed, involving detailed background investigations, gradual cultivation of relationships, and sophisticated approaches that minimized the risk of exposure to military authorities. The financial incentives offered to potential recruits were extraordinary by military standards, with salaries that exceeded military pay by factors of 10 or 20. Basic compensation for new Zetas recruits started at levels that exceeded the salaries of senior military officers, while performance bonuses and special assignments could generate income that rivaled that of successful business executives. However, the recruitment appeals went beyond simple financial motivation to include promises of respect, professional advancement, and opportunities to utilize specialized skills in ways that military service had not provided. The cartel's recruitment strategy recognized that elite soldiers were motivated by more than money, incorporating appeals to professional pride, personal ambition, and the desire for recognition and advancement. The recruitment process also emphasized the professional nature of the organization that recruits would be joining, presenting the Zetas as an elite unit that would maintain military standards of discipline, training, and operational excellence. This appeal to professional identity was crucial for attracting individuals who had dedicated their lives to military service and who valued the institutional culture and traditions associated with elite military units. The initial group of recruits numbered approximately 30 individuals, all of whom possessed advanced military training and combat experience. This core group formed the foundation of what would become known as the original Zetas, named after the radio call sign Z that had been used by Guzman de Tena during his military service. The adoption of this designation reflected the organization's military origins and the professional identity that distinguished its members from traditional criminal enforcers. The training programs developed for the Zetas incorporated the most advanced military techniques available, drawing on the specialized knowledge that recruits had acquired during their military service, while adapting these skills to the specific requirements of criminal operations. The training emphasized small unit tactics, urban warfare, intelligence gathering, surveillance techniques, and the use of sophisticated weapons systems that provided significant advantages over both rival organizations and law enforcement agencies. The physical conditioning requirements for Zetas membership were extremely demanding, reflecting the organization's commitment to maintaining military standards of fitness and performance. Training programs included extensive physical fitness regimens, marksmanship practice, tactical exercises, and psychological conditioning that prepared members for the high-stress environments they would encounter during operational deployments. The weapons training provided to Zetas members was comprehensive and sophisticated, covering not only basic marksmanship but also advanced techniques for urban combat, close quarters battle, and the employment of specialized weapons systems. Training included instruction in the use of assault rifles, sniper weapons, grenades, rocket-propelled grenades, and other military-grade equipment that provided tactical advantages over adversaries. The operational philosophy that guided the Zetas' development emphasized discipline, professionalism, and systematic approaches to violence that distinguished their activities from the chaotic brutality that had characterized earlier generations of Mexican criminal organizations. The group operated according to military principles of command structure, operational security, and tactical coordination that enabled them to conduct complex operations with precision and effectiveness. The command structure established for the Zetas reflected military organizational principles, with clear hierarchies, defined responsibilities, and systematic approaches to decision-making and operational coordination. This structure enabled the organization to function effectively across multiple operational theaters, while maintaining security and discipline that exceeded anything seen in traditional criminal organizations. The weapons and equipment provided to the Zetas were far superior to anything previously seen in Mexican organized crime, including military-grade assault rifles, grenades, rocket-propelled grenades, armored vehicles, and sophisticated communication systems. The financial resources of the Gulf Cartel enabled the acquisition of equipment that was typically restricted to military and law enforcement agencies, providing the Zetas with capabilities that exceeded those of many official security forces. The procurement networks established to acquire this advanced equipment were sophisticated and secure, utilizing international suppliers, corrupt military personnel, and black market dealers who could provide access to restricted weapons and technology. The organization's financial resources enabled the purchase of equipment directly from manufacturers, while corruption networks provided access to items that were officially restricted to government agencies. The communication systems utilized by the Zetas included encrypted radio networks, satellite communications, and sophisticated coordination protocols that enabled real-time command and control over dispersed operations. These systems provided security against government interception while ensuring that complex operations could be coordinated effectively across multiple participants and locations. The initial missions assigned to the Zetas focused primarily on providing personal security for Osiel and other senior Gulf Cartel leaders, protecting valuable shipments during transportation, and conducting intelligence operations against rival organizations and government forces. These early operations demonstrated the effectiveness of military-trained personnel in criminal contexts, while providing valuable experience that would inform future tactical developments. The personal security missions involved the establishment of sophisticated protective details that utilized military techniques for threat assessment, route planning, and defensive positioning. The Zetas implemented security protocols that exceeded anything previously seen in Mexican organized crime, including the use of advanced teams, counter-surveillance operations, and emergency response procedures that provided comprehensive protection for high-value targets. The success of these initial operations led to an expansion of the Zetas' responsibilities within the Gulf Cartel organization, as Osiel recognized the strategic value of having access to military-level capabilities for both defensive and offensive operations. The group began conducting more aggressive missions, including targeted eliminations of rival leaders, raids on competitor facilities, and confrontations with law enforcement agencies that demonstrated unprecedented levels of tactical sophistication. The targeted elimination operations conducted by the Zetas were characterized by careful planning, professional execution, and minimal collateral damage that distinguished them from the chaotic violence employed by traditional criminal groups. These operations utilized military intelligence techniques to identify targets, surveillance methods to establish patterns and vulnerabilities, and tactical approaches that maximized success while minimizing risks to to operational personnel. The raids on competitor facilities demonstrated the Zetas' ability to conduct complex offensive operations that required coordination, timing, and tactical expertise that exceeded the capabilities of traditional criminal organizations. These operations often involved multiple teams working in coordination to achieve objectives that included the seizure of territory, elimination of rival personnel, and capture of valuable assets. The psychological impact of the Zetas' operations was enormous, as their military discipline and advanced capabilities created fear that extended far beyond their immediate targets. Rival criminal organizations found themselves confronting adversaries whose training and equipment exceeded their own capabilities, while law enforcement agencies struggled to adapt to threats that surpassed their traditional preparation and resources. The reputation for effectiveness and professionalism that the Zetas developed during their early operations made them legendary within Mexican criminal circles and feared by government forces. Stories of their tactical capabilities, discipline, and ruthless efficiency spread throughout the underworld, creating psychological advantages that often enabled them to achieve objectives without actual confrontation. The recruitment efforts continued throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the success of the initial group attracted additional military personnel who were drawn by both the financial opportunities and the professional challenges associated with Zetas' membership. The organization's reputation for effectiveness and professionalism made it an attractive option for soldiers who felt undervalued or underutilized in conventional military service. The expansion of the Zetas also involved the recruitment of personnel from other government agencies, including federal and state police forces, whose training and experience provided valuable capabilities for criminal operations. These recruits brought expertise in law enforcement techniques, investigation procedures, and government operations that enhanced the organization's intelligence and counterintelligence capabilities. The training facilities established by the Zetas were sophisticated installations that provided instruction in advanced combat techniques, weapons maintenance, tactical planning, and operational security. These facilities were located in remote areas that provided security from government surveillance, while offering realistic training environments that prepared members for the challenges they would face in operational deployments. The training curriculum developed for new recruits was comprehensive and demanding, requiring months of intensive instruction before individuals were considered ready for operational assignments. The program included physical conditioning, weapons training, tactical instruction, intelligence techniques, and psychological preparation that created highly capable operatives who could function effectively in high-stress environments. The code of conduct developed for Zetas members emphasized loyalty, discipline, and professionalism that distinguished the organization from other criminal groups. Members were expected to maintain physical fitness, follow operational protocols, and demonstrate the same level of professional behavior that had been required during their military service. Violations of this code were met with severe punishment that could include expulsion or more extreme consequences. The intelligence capabilities developed by the Zetas were remarkable for their sophistication and effectiveness, incorporating military intelligence techniques with criminal operational requirements. The organization maintained extensive networks of informants, employed advanced surveillance technologies, and conducted systematic analysis of threats and opportunities that provided significant advantages over both rival organizations and government forces. The surveillance techniques employed by the Zetas included electronic monitoring, human intelligence operations, and technical surveillance that provided comprehensive information about targets and threats. These capabilities enabled the organization to anticipate enemy actions, identify vulnerabilities, and coordinate complex operations with precision that exceeded anything previously seen in Mexican organized crime. The territorial expansion of Zetas operations began as the organization's reputation for effectiveness led to requests for their services from Gulf cartel operations throughout Mexico. The group's mobility and advanced capabilities made them ideal for missions that required rapid deployment to different regions, leading to their involvement in conflicts and operations far from their original base in Tamaulipas. The success of these expanded operations demonstrated the scalability of the Zetas model and led to the establishment of regional cells that could provide similar capabilities in different areas of Mexico. These regional deployments deployments required the recruitment and training of additional personnel while maintaining the organizational discipline and operational effectiveness that had characterized the original group. The impact of the Zetas on the broader landscape of Mexican organized crime was transformative, as their success prompted other criminal organizations to seek similar capabilities through the recruitment of military and law enforcement personnel. This trend led to an arms race of sorts, as different groups competed to acquire the most advanced training, weapons, and personnel available. The militarization of Mexican organized crime that resulted from the Zetas' innovation had profound implications for the nature of criminal conflict and the challenges facing law enforcement agencies. Traditional police forces found themselves confronting adversaries whose capabilities exceeded their own, while military involvement in law enforcement operations became increasingly necessary to address threats that civilian agencies could not handle. The evolution of the Zetas from a personal security detail to an independent operational force occurred gradually over several years as their growing capabilities and reputation led to increased autonomy within the Gulf cartel structure. This evolution was facilitated by the financial resources that the group generated through their own operations, which reduced their dependence on the broader cartel organization. The diversification of Zetas' activities extended beyond traditional security functions to include independent criminal operations such as kidnapping, extortion, controlled substances trafficking, and various forms of contraband smuggling. These activities generated substantial revenues that funded further expansion while providing operational experience that enhanced the organization's capabilities. The technological innovations adopted by the Zetas included the use of drones for surveillance, GPS tracking systems for coordination, sophisticated encryption for communications, and advanced weapon systems that provided tactical advantages over adversaries. These technological capabilities were acquired through international suppliers and represented investments that exceeded those of many official military organizations. The training partnerships developed by the Zetas with international military contractors and former special forces personnel from various countries provided access to the most advanced tactical techniques and operational methodologies available. These partnerships reflected the organization's commitment to maintaining technological and tactical superiority over both rival criminal groups and government forces. The psychological warfare techniques employed by the Zetas included the strategic use of extreme violence to create fear and intimidation, the dissemination of propaganda through various media channels, and the cultivation of reputations for invincibility that served to demoralize opponents before conflicts even began. These techniques were derived from military psychological operations training and proved highly effective in criminal contexts. The international attention that the Zetas attracted from intelligence agencies and military organizations around the world reflected recognition of their significance as a new form of criminal organization that challenged traditional approaches to law enforcement and national security. The group's capabilities and operational methods were studied by security professionals who recognized their potential influence on criminal organizations in other regions. The internal conflicts that began to emerge within the Gulf cartel organization during the mid-2000s were partly attributed to tensions between traditional criminal leaders and the increasingly independent Zetas organization. These tensions reflected fundamental differences in organizational culture, operational philosophy, and strategic vision that would eventually lead to formal separation. The recruitment of younger personnel who lacked military experience but were attracted by the Zetas' reputation and financial opportunities led to changes in the organization's character and operational methods. These newer recruits often lacked the discipline and professionalism that had characterized the original members, leading to more chaotic and brutal operations that damaged the group's reputation for professional excellence. The expansion of Zetas' operations into new criminal markets such as human trafficking, petroleum theft, and large-scale extortion schemes reflected the organization's evolution from a specialized security force to a comprehensive criminal enterprise capable of competing with established cartels in multiple illicit markets. The legacy of the Zetas' creation extended far beyond their immediate impact on Mexican organized crime, as their model of military criminal fusion influenced criminal organizations throughout Latin America and beyond. The techniques and organizational methods pioneered by the group were studied and adapted by criminal criminal organizations in Colombia, Central America, and other regions where similar conditions existed. By the mid-2000s, the Zetas had evolved from Osiel's personal security detail into one of Mexico's most powerful and feared criminal organizations, commanding resources and capabilities that rivaled those of official military forces. Their success had fundamentally altered the nature of organized crime in Mexico, while creating new challenges for law enforcement agencies that struggled to adapt to threats that exceeded their traditional preparation and resources. The monster that Osiel had created was beginning to develop ambitions and capabilities that exceeded his original vision, setting the stage for conflicts that would reshape the criminal landscape of Mexico and ultimately contribute to his own downfall. The success of his innovation would prove to be both his greatest achievement and the source of his eventual destruction, as the organization he had founded grew beyond his control and developed interests that diverged from those of the Gulf Cartel itself. The beginning of the end for Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's criminal empire came not through dramatic confrontations or spectacular battles, but through the patient, methodical work of intelligence analysts and financial investigators who understood that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations leave traces that can be exploited by persistent law enforcement efforts. By the early 2000s, both Mexican and United States authorities had recognized that traditional approaches to combating organized crime were insufficient against organizations that possessed military-level capabilities and resources that exceeded those of many government agencies. The transformation of the Zetas from Osiel's personal security detail into an increasingly independent and violent organization had created new challenges that extended far beyond the traditional scope of criminal enforcement. The militarization of organized crime that Osiel had pioneered was generating levels of violence and instability that threatened the fundamental governance structures of Mexican society, creating political pressures that could no longer be ignored by either government. President Vicente Fox, who had taken office in 2000 as the first opposition candidate to win the Mexican presidency in 70 years, faced enormous pressure to demonstrate that his administration could address the growing challenges posed by organized crime. The democratic transition that had brought Fox to power had also created new expectations for government accountability and effectiveness that made tolerance of criminal impunity increasingly politically unsustainable. The United States government, under President George W. Bush, had identified Mexican organized crime as a significant national security threat that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and resource commitment. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks had heightened American awareness of border security issues while providing justification for expanded law enforcement cooperation that had previously been constrained by sovereignty concerns and jurisdictional limitations. The intelligence sharing agreements that were negotiated between Mexican and American agencies during this period provided access to surveillance technologies and analytical capabilities that enabled the systematic tracking of criminal organizations in ways that had not been previously possible. Satellite surveillance, electronic intercepts, and financial analysis techniques developed for counterterrorism operations were adapted for use against organized crime groups that possessed sophisticated security measures and international networks. The financial investigation that would ultimately lead to Osiel's downfall began with the systematic analysis of banking records, asset purchases, and money transfer patterns that revealed the complex networks used by the Gulf Cartel to launder criminal proceeds. International banking cooperation agreements enabled investigators to track financial transactions across multiple countries and currencies, revealing the scope and sophistication of the organization's money laundering operations. The breakthrough in the investigation came when analysts identified patterns in bulk cash shipments and electronic transfers that indicated regular movement of substantial sums between specific financial institutions in Mexico and the United States. These patterns were inconsistent with legitimate business activities, but consistent with systematic money laundering operations designed to convert criminal proceeds into apparently legitimate assets. The surveillance operations that were conducted against Osiel and his organization represented the most sophisticated law enforcement effort ever directed against a Mexican criminal leader. The operations utilized advanced technology, including satellite satellite surveillance, electronic intercepts, and human intelligence networks that provided comprehensive coverage of the Gulf Cartel's activities and movements. The intelligence gathered through these operations revealed the full scope of Osiel's empire, including detailed information about organizational structure, operational methods, financial networks, and corruption relationships that had previously been unknown to law enforcement agencies. This intelligence provided the foundation for a comprehensive strategy designed to dismantle the entire organization rather than simply capturing individual leaders. The decision to prioritize Osiel's capture reflected recognition that his leadership was essential to the Gulf Cartel's effectiveness and that his removal could potentially destabilize the entire organization. However, this strategy also recognized the risks associated with creating another power vacuum that could lead to increased violence as different factions competed for control. The operational planning for Osiel's capture involved extensive coordination between Mexican military forces, federal police agencies, and American intelligence services that provided technical support and real-time information sharing. The complexity of these operations reflected both the sophisticated security measures employed by the Gulf Cartel and the determination of government forces to ensure success despite the obvious risks involved. The incident that would ultimately lead to Osiel's identification and targeting by law enforcement occurred in November 1999, when he and his security detail confronted Drug Enforcement Administration agents and FBI personnel at a restaurant in Matamoros. The confrontation, which became known as the Matamoros incident, demonstrated the extent to which criminal organizations had become willing to directly challenge United States government personnel, marking a significant escalation in the conflict between organized crime and law enforcement. During this confrontation, Osiel personally threatened DEA agent Joe Dubois and FBI agent Daniel Fuentes, telling them that he knew who they were and where they lived, and warning them to be careful when operating in his territory. This direct challenge to American law enforcement personnel was unprecedented and provided the justification for an intensive manhunt that would continue until his eventual capture. The psychological impact of this incident on American law enforcement was enormous, as it demonstrated that Mexican criminal leaders had become sufficiently powerful and confident to directly threaten United States government personnel operating in official capacities. The incident became a symbol of the extent to which traditional law enforcement approaches had become inadequate against organizations that possessed military-level capabilities and territorial control. The response to the Matamoros incident involved the mobilization of unprecedented resources for the pursuit of a single criminal leader, reflecting both the symbolic importance of the case and the recognition that Osiel represented a new type of threat that required new approaches to law enforcement. The investigation that followed involved hundreds of personnel from multiple agencies and represented one of the largest international law enforcement operations ever conducted against organized crime. The intelligence-gathering efforts that supported the manhunt for Osiel included comprehensive surveillance of his known associates, family members, and business interests that gradually constructed a detailed picture of his movements and activities. The investigation revealed the sophisticated security measures that he employed, including multiple safe houses, frequent changes of location, and extensive counter-surveillance operations that made his capture extremely challenging. The corruption networks that protected Osiel's operations were extensive and deeply embedded within Mexican government institutions, requiring careful coordination to ensure that operational plans were not compromised by corrupt officials who might provide advance warning of law enforcement activities. The investigation identified specific individuals within government agencies who were providing information to criminal organizations, leading to parallel investigations that ultimately resulted in numerous arrests and prosecutions. The technological capabilities that law enforcement agencies deployed against Osiel included advanced surveillance systems, communication intercepts, and tracking technologies that provided real-time information about his movements and activities. However, the Gulf Cartel's own technological sophistication meant that these advantages were often temporary, as the organization adapted its security measures to counter specific threats as they became apparent. The cat-and-mouse game that developed between law enforcement and Osiel's security organization continued for several years, with each side adapting their tactics and technologies in response to the other's innovations. The Gulf Cartel's access to former military personnel and advanced equipment enabled them to implement security measures that exceeded those employed by many government officials, while law enforcement agencies were forced to develop new approaches specifically designed to counter military-level threats. The breakthrough that ultimately led to Osiel's capture came through a combination of electronic surveillance and human intelligence that revealed his presence at a specific location during a narrow window of opportunity. The operation that was launched to capture him involved coordinated actions by multiple agencies and represented one of the largest law enforcement operations ever conducted in Mexico. The capture operation took place on March 14, 2003, when Mexican military forces surrounded a safe house in Matamoros, where intelligence indicated that Osiel was present. The operation involved hundreds of personnel and sophisticated coordination designed to prevent his escape while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties or the destruction of valuable intelligence materials. The resistance encountered during the capture operation was intense, as Zetas personnel attempted to defend their leader using military tactics and advanced weapons that created a prolonged firefight in an urban environment. The confrontation demonstrated the extent to which criminal organizations had become willing to engage government forces in direct combat, marking a significant escalation in the level of violence associated with law enforcement operations. Osiel's eventual surrender came only after it became clear that escape was impossible and that continued resistance would likely result in his elimination rather than capture. His decision to surrender reflected both tactical realism and a recognition that survival might depend on entering the legal system rather than dying in a futile confrontation with overwhelming government forces. The immediate aftermath of Osiel's capture created the power vacuum that many observers had predicted, as different factions within the Gulf Cartel organization competed for control, while external enemies attempted to exploit the organization's temporary weakness. However, the violence that erupted following his capture exceeded even pessimistic expectations, as the Zetas organization began to assert its independence from traditional Gulf Cartel leadership. The legal proceedings that followed Osiel's capture were complicated by jurisdictional issues, extradition requests, and the security challenges associated with prosecuting a criminal leader whose organization retained the capability to threaten court personnel, prosecutors, and witnesses. The Mexican government's decision to prosecute him domestically rather than immediately agreeing to extradition reflected both sovereignty concerns and practical security considerations. However, the security situation in Mexican prisons proved inadequate for containing a criminal leader whose organization possessed military-level capabilities and extensive corruption networks. Intelligence reports indicated that Osiel was continuing to direct Gulf Cartel operations from prison while planning escape attempts that could have succeeded without extraordinary security measures that strained government resources. The extradition of Osiel to the United States was finalized in January 2007, following years of legal proceedings that demonstrated the complexity of international law enforcement cooperation in cases involving sophisticated criminal organizations. His transfer to American custody marked the end of his direct involvement in Mexican organized crime operations while beginning a new phase of legal proceedings that would ultimately result in his conviction and imprisonment. The plea agreement that Osiel ultimately negotiated with United States prosecutors reflected both the strength of the evidence against him and his recognition that cooperation might provide the only possibility for eventually returning to Mexico. His guilty plea to charges including conspiracy to traffic controlled substances and conspiracy to assault federal agents resulted in a 25-year prison sentence that effectively ended his career as a criminal leader. However, the removal of Osiel from active leadership of the Gulf Cartel did not result in the organization's dissolution or even significant reduction in its activities. Instead, his absence created opportunities for the Zetas organization to assert complete independence while implementing their own vision for criminal enterprise that proved even more violent and destabilizing than anything that had preceded it. The war between the Zetas and the remaining Gulf Cartel leadership that erupted following Osiel's extradition represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of Mexican organized crime. The conflict was characterized by unprecedented levels of violence, sophisticated military tactics, and territorial ambitions that extended throughout Mexico and into Central America. The Zetas, under the leadership of Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Treviño Morales, implemented strategies that went beyond traditional criminal activities to include systematic terrorism against civilian populations, government officials, and rival organizations. Their tactics included mass kidnappings, public torture and execution displays, and attacks on government facilities that challenged the Mexican state's monopoly on violence in ways that had not been seen since the Mexican Revolution. The expansion of Zetas operations throughout Mexico during the years following Osiel's capture demonstrated the scalability of the military criminal model that he had created. The organization established territorial control in regions far from its original base in Tamaulipas, utilizing the same recruitment and training methods that had proven successful in building the original organization. The recruitment of additional military personnel, police officers, and young men attracted by the organization's reputation and financial resources enabled the Zetas to maintain their military character while expanding their operational capabilities. However, the recruitment of individuals who lacked the discipline and professionalism of the original members led to increased brutality and decreased operational security that ultimately contributed to law enforcement successes against the organization. The diversification of Zetas' criminal activities extended far beyond traditional narcotics trafficking to include petroleum theft, kidnapping, extortion, human trafficking, and various forms of contraband smuggling that generated enormous revenues while terrorizing civilian populations. These activities demonstrated the evolution of the organization from a specialized security force to a comprehensive criminal enterprise capable of challenging government authority across multiple domains. The technological innovations that the Zetas continued to implement included advanced communication systems, sophisticated weapons, surveillance equipment, and coordination technologies that enabled complex operations across vast territories. However, their increasing reliance on technology also created vulnerabilities that law enforcement agencies learned to exploit through electronic surveillance and communication intercepts. The international expansion of Zetas operations extended their influence throughout Central America, where they established partnerships with local criminal groups and implemented the same military criminal model that had proven successful in Mexico. This expansion created new security challenges for governments throughout the region while demonstrating the export potential of the organizational innovations that Osiel had pioneered. The response of the Mexican government to the challenges posed by the Zetas and other militarized criminal organizations required fundamental changes in law enforcement strategy and resource allocation. The deployment of military forces for domestic security operations became routine, while the development of specialized police units with military training and equipment became necessary to address threats that exceeded traditional law enforcement capabilities. The human costs associated with the transformation of Mexican organized crime that Osiel had initiated were enormous, as the violence generated by militarized criminal organizations affected hundreds of thousands of people throughout Mexico and Central America. The systematic use of terrorism by criminal organizations created a climate of fear that undermined social cohesion and economic development, while challenging the basic functions of government institutions. The economic impact of increased criminal violence included reduced investment, tourism decline, business disruption, and massive expenditures on security measures that diverted resources from productive activities. The transformation of entire regions into conflict zones, controlled by criminal organizations, created humanitarian crises that required international assistance while generating refugee flows that affected neighboring countries. The legacy of Osiel's innovations in criminal organization extended far beyond the immediate participants in organized crime to influence law enforcement strategies, military doctrine, and government policies throughout the hemisphere. The techniques and organizational methods that he had pioneered were studied and adapted by criminal organizations in other countries, while prompting governments to develop new approaches to internal security. The militarization of law enforcement that became necessary to address the threats posed by organizations like the Zetas created new challenges for democratic governance and civil liberties that continue to affect Mexican society. The involvement of military forces in domestic law enforcement operations raised questions about the appropriate balance between security and civil rights that remain unresolved. The corruption of government institutions that had enabled Osiel's rise to power proved to be a lasting legacy that continues to undermine the effectiveness of law enforcement and governance throughout Mexico. The systematic penetration of government agencies by criminal organizations created institutional weaknesses that persist despite ongoing reform efforts and international assistance programs. The influence of Osiel's organizational innovations on criminal groups throughout Latin America demonstrated the international implications of developments in Mexican organized crime. The export of military criminal tactics and organizational methods contributed to increased violence and instability in countries throughout the region, while creating new challenges for international law enforcement cooperation. The academic and policy attention that Osiel's case attracted from researchers and analysts throughout the world reflected recognition of its significance as a watershed moment in the evolution of organized crime. The techniques and strategies that he had pioneered became subjects of study for security professionals who recognized their potential influence on criminal organizations in other regions and contexts. The ongoing imprisonment of Osiel in the United States has not eliminated his influence on Mexican organized crime, as his reputation and the organizational innovations that he pioneered continue to influence criminal groups throughout the region. His case has become a symbol of both the potential for criminal organizations to challenge government authority and the ultimate consequences of pursuing such strategies. The lessons learned from Osiel's rise and fall continue to influence contemporary approaches to combating organized crime, demonstrating both the importance of addressing the root causes that enable criminal recruitment and the necessity of maintaining law enforcement capabilities that can address sophisticated threats. His case illustrates the complex relationships between economic inequality, institutional weakness, and criminal opportunity that create conditions favorable to organized crime development. The transformation of Mexican society that resulted from the militarization of organized crime that Osiel initiated represents one of the most significant security challenges of the early 21st century. The violence and instability generated by militarized criminal organizations continue to affect millions of people while creating challenges that extend far beyond traditional law enforcement capabilities. The international dimensions of the problems created by Osiel's innovations demonstrate the interconnected nature of contemporary security challenges and the necessity of international cooperation in addressing threats that transcend national boundaries. The criminal organizations that evolved from his original concepts continue to operate across multiple countries while adapting to changing law enforcement strategies and technological developments. The study of Osiel's career provides insights into the factors that enable the emergence of sophisticated criminal organizations and the challenges associated with combating groups that possess military-level capabilities and resources. His case demonstrates both the importance of preventing the conditions that enable criminal recruitment and the necessity of maintaining effective law enforcement institutions capable of addressing complex threats. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén, we are confronted with a sobering reminder of how individual decisions can have consequences that extend far beyond their original scope and intentions. The young man from Matamoros who sought to protect his criminal empire through military innovation created a monster that would ultimately consume not only his own organization, but contribute to a transformation of Mexican society that continues to generate suffering and instability. The story of Osiel serves as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of pursuing power through violence and the ways in which criminal innovations can escape the control of their creators to generate challenges that affect entire societies. His legacy reminds us that the choices made by individual leaders, whether in legitimate or criminal contexts, can have implications that persist long after those leaders have been removed from positions of authority. The ongoing violence and instability that characterize much of Mexico today can be traced directly to the innovations that Osiel pioneered during his brief but transformative period of leadership. The militarization of organized crime that he initiated has created challenges that continue to test the capabilities of government institutions while affecting the daily lives of millions of people throughout the region. For those who have followed this examination of one of the most significant figures in the history of organized crime, we hope this exploration has provided insights into the complex factors that enable the emergence of sophisticated criminal organizations and the lasting consequences of their activities. The story of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén serves as a reminder that the past has important lessons to teach about the nature of power, violence, and the unintended consequences of revolutionary change. If you have found this deep dive into the transformation of Mexican organized crime compelling, we invite you to subscribe to Crímenes para Dormir, where we continue to explore explore the most significant criminal cases and historical developments that have shaped our world. Join us as we examine the human stories behind the headlines and analyze the complex factors that drive individuals toward paths that ultimately lead to tragedy and destruction.